welcome to Paydirt TV. I'm Dominic Piper. Today I'm joined by Adrian Griffin, Managing Director at Lithium Australia. Adrian, thanks for coming in.
Pleasure, Dominic.
Adrian, pretty remarkable start to the year for the battery minerals suite of commodities. We've had Ukraine, we've had the associated trade sanctions, we've seen the LME have to put a stop on trading of nickel because of the price fluctuations there. Then we've had the Chinese influencing lithium prices internationally. Is this really showing the unease that there is globally in the supply chains for these commodity of battery minerals?
Oh, there's absolutely no doubt about it. And those supply chains are fragile, as we've seen. And you've only got to look at the nickel price running from a month back at $11 a pound up to 21. And in fact, with the LME closing, the prices recorded on trades of $50 have been obliterated by history. They'll never be seen again, but it did trade that high, and those trades were reversed, of course, by the LME, and then the LME went into suspension. In the meantime, cobalt went up 20% over the same period of time, and have a look at lithium. 12 months, gone up 550%. So people are trying to simplify the supply chains and get supply security, and I didn't think we'd see Beijing wading into it and starting to try and control lithium prices, but that has happened in the last couple of weeks, and I just hope they don't do the same thing to the market as they did with rare earths about 8 years ago.
Why are we seeing this, do you think? What is it about the markets in particular and these commodities in particular? I'm thinking lithium in this regard. Why is there such tightness and such fragility in those markets?
Well, clearly it's supply and demand, and it's getting it through that pipeline. There are restrictions in the middle of the pipeline. There's plenty of demand there, and quite frankly, with things like lithium concentrates at the moment, potentially plenty of supply, but you can't squeeze it through the downstream processing to turn into lithium chemicals, batteries, and then deliver it to EVs. So what the end users, and when I say end users, I'm talking about, to a large extent, the EV producers and energy storage producers. What the end users are doing now is trying to position themselves in that supply chain by vertical integration, and they're starting to invest at project level to make sure they've got a constant supply of the commodities that they require.
We've certainly seen the likes of Tesla, LG Energy, Samsung and others take, POSCO for instance, take positions in off-take positions and indeed equity positions in Australian companies. There seems to be that global geopolitical dimension to this as well. We're seeing moves from the likes of the US, the EU, the UK, Japan and Korea into trying to put a foot on supply as well. Is that fair to say?
Well, absolutely no doubt. And most of those things are geared towards creating alternative supply chains outside China. And if you look at the United States, which is probably the best example, they have the policy that's colloquially called the Biden battery blueprint, and that's about starting at raw materials, fostering the extraction industry, the development of cathode powders, going right through to batteries. And what that says is, in a few years' time, fellas, if you're producing batteries in the United States, it has to be a completely domestic supply chain. That creates some great openings, and I think the same's going to happen in the EU, but for a different reason. And in 2026, the EU will implement very strong constraints on emissions, and at this stage the draft legislation effectively says if you produce a product that's not zero carbon, it cannot cross a national boundary in Europe. So what happens? You've got to develop domestic supply chains. So there's a big push politically to do that.
We're also seeing within that, it's not as though the battery chemistry and the product that they're producing for EVs is set in stone. We're seeing a lot of competing technologies at the moment. Do you think there'll be winners and losers out of this technology race?
Oh, there's absolutely no doubt. And I think if you look at the battery chemistries across the board, all of them have a place in the market. There's no doubt about that. But I think because of these supply chain constraints, we're seeing a big move, particularly with the EV producers, towards lithium ferrophosphate, LFP, because it has no nickel and no cobalt. And if you do that, you can simplify the supply chains. And if you go back to that policy that the EU will implement, what that means is we won't be able to any longer move a spodumene concentrate, for example, from here to China for processing into a lithium chemical and then back to Europe. There's no way you're going to get a zero carbon footprint doing that. So one of the things you can do is change the chemistry of the batteries so you can actually streamline those supply chains, and LFP, lithium ferrophosphate, does that for you.
We've talked a lot about the US, the EU, China. What about Australia? Where does Australia sit in this unfolding story?
Well, as usual, Australia's not doing much about it. Now, Australia has the golden opportunity here, of course, particularly with the changes in chemistry and the ability to build new supply chains that go direct to the end users, and really the federal government needs to be doing something about it. But at the moment, very little.
The other element that we haven't touched on in that whole life cycle of the battery is recycling. Where does that fit in, do you think, in the future production of battery minerals?
Oh, quite clearly the market is growing at such a rapid rate that it's not going to make a big impact until the market stabilises and you get a situation where effectively you've got just-in-time inventories and what goes out of service gets replaced by a new product, and then recycling will be of paramount importance. But I think the companies that position themselves today and lead the field, of course, will get the lion's share of that business. And that's a huge amount of business, because only years down the track we're looking at millions of tonnes of batteries annually to recycle.
Talking about positioning a company to take advantage of this new global phenomena, you've got a company, Lithium Australia, sat there, once a traditional Australian junior explorer, but now has very many different divisions and elements to it. How are you positioning the company to take advantage of this wave of opportunity?
Well, I think there are two factors there, Dominic. The first, of course, is the development of LFP cathode powders. We took over a company, VSPC Limited, and that company has now been in existence for 20 years making nano powders. The last 12 years of that LFP, and we are making the best LFP in the world. What we're doing now is pushing that towards commercialisation with a view of hitting the markets with commercial production by about 2025. That's our plan. Now, on the other side of the ledger, of course, we also took over a company, Lithium Australia Proprietary Limited. That's now a wholly owned subsidiary. So I'm sounding Irish here, we own 100% of it. So that's what wholly owned subsidiaries are all about. So yeah, we own 100% of that. We've got 2 plants in operation in Melbourne. They are the only plants that are completely permitted for the recycling of lithium-ion batteries, and we're looking at New South Wales and abroad as well.
So what's the opportunity now then for investors looking at Lithium Australia? Is it a chance to inject themselves directly into this opportunity?
Oh, absolutely, no doubt. It's been a long path to success, but now as we see the market starting to open up, and with respect to EnviroStream and recycling, of course, there is now the battery stewardship scheme in Australia, which effectively charges a levy on batteries at the point of sale. That money goes round, goes back to the companies, the certified collectors and sorters and recyclers of those materials. And of course, we own much of that supply chain in that we do collect, we do sort, and we do recycle. So, and believe me, the volumes are starting to increase dramatically as a consequence of these moves. And those moves just aren't, of course, the battery stewardship scheme. The consumer now, to a large extent, demands that there be recycled product in what they buy. And when I say consumers, I'm talking about the large chemical producers and what have you. So they go to a refinery and they ask the company refining these materials, is there any recycled material in this? And the answer has to be yes, or they don't get an offtake agreement. So, there's a big push there, and of course we're leading the field in Australia, almost without competition, and the lithium ferrophosphate, that's just looking fantastic. And I think if you look at the way the EV industry is going, every major EV producer, apart from GM, today produces vehicles with a choice of LFP batteries in it. And that's because they're cheaper to make, they're safer, and they last a lot longer, and they don't have nickel and cobalt.
I certainly test drove a Tesla 3 the other day, and that's an LFP battery, and it was pretty impressive, I must admit. Adrian, thanks for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again in a couple of weeks' time at the Battery Minerals Conference that we're hosting here in Perth. Best of luck with Lithium Australia, and we look forward to having a further chat, because even though it's only 10 days away, that conference, the global situation will probably change again. Thanks very much.
It certainly will. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks, Dom.